Welcome to Survivors Speak Up with SARA. My name is Sarah Coons. I'm a rape survivor and the founder of the mobile app and nonprofit called Sexual Assault Recovery Assistant, aka SARA. In the United States, someone is sexually assaulted or raped every 68 seconds. Survivors are everywhere. But what happens after trauma? In this podcast, you'll hear the true stories of survivors. You'll learn coping tools from the pros and help build a community of empowered survivors, bystanders, and allies. So get ready for stories of heartbreak, inspiration, resilience, and courage. Before we dive in, here's a quick reminder that we do talk about real life situations in this episode. If at any point you feel like it's too much, you can always pause and step away, or feel free to use the resources we have listed in the episode description. Thanks. My guest today is Kathleen Flinton. She's a social worker and her area of expertise is in cross-cultural trauma treatment with a specialization in working with refugees and asylum seekers. In her clinical practice, she provides mental health treatment to survivors of torture, trafficking, war, and human rights abuses. Additionally, Kathleen is assistant professor of practice at Boston College School of Social Work and the co-chair of their Trauma Integration Initiative. Kathleen has postgraduate training in EMDR, sensory motor psychotherapy, and maternal mental health. I'm so thrilled to have her here today because Kathleen Flinton is actually one of the first trauma specialists I spoke to when starting Sexual Assault Recovery Assistant. And in our conversation, we came across something we ended up calling the gap, which you'll be hearing a lot about in this episode. The gap refers to that space between understanding you experienced some sort of trauma and seeking treatment, whether that's telling a friend, going to a support group, or starting to go to therapy. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Kathleen Flinton. Welcome to the show. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So I told listeners a little bit already about your background, but before we dive into the meat of our conversation, I was hoping you could give us a little more context into your world as it pertains to our conversation, because you have your feet in higher education as well as a clinical practice.
Yes. So I come to academia through my clinical practice specifically. So I didn't come up through higher education quite by going and getting my PhD. I got my master's in social work, and then I went into clinical practice and was only in clinical practice for a number of years. So I started actually my first job out of social work school. I was a social worker in a level 1 trauma center emergency room here in Boston. So I had gone into my MSW knowing that I wanted to do trauma work. Didn't know that I was going to end up working in an emergency room, and really got a whole different perspective on trauma work by being a first responder to survivors as they came into the emergency room. So I continued kind of clinically doing my trauma work in a couple of different settings, and eventually got an invite to teach a class at a school of social work. And so taught my first clinical practice class with trauma, and I think it was 2012, 2013, and really, really loved being with the students. So I've been really fortunate to be able to have one foot in clinical practice and one foot in academia all of these years. And sometimes I'm a little bit more on one side and more on the other, but I've been very, very lucky to be able to maintain both.
Yeah, and I imagine your students and clients are pretty lucky to have you as well in both areas.
Well, thank you. I mean, I think teaching makes my clinical practice so much stronger, and my clinical practice makes my teaching so much stronger. So I think it's just been a really nice confluence of some things.
Yeah. So I kind of know this story, and I know it's like a little short, sweet story. But I read about and talked to you about how you were volunteering and had this experience where you realized basically everybody had to be a social worker. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. When I first moved to Boston in I'm dating myself here, but 1999, I think it was, I was looking for a job, and I had done my first master's in religion at Yale Divinity School, and kind of wasn't sure what I was going to do with that. And so I started, while I was looking for a job, I started volunteering at an immigrant and refugee social service organization in Boston. And I really liked it. And so I asked if I could get more involved. And I found myself among a team of social service providers that were doing this incredible work in supporting refugees and asylum seekers. And I was quite taken with the work that they were doing. And I looked around, and everyone around me was a social worker. And so that, I think, was a moment when I knew that I wanted to be a social worker, to go get my MSW. And it was interesting because when I told my father that I was going to get my MSW, I thought he was going to say, "What are you doing? Why are you getting another master's degree? The first one was so expensive, I'm sure, loans." And instead, his response was really interesting, is that he talked to me about how much social workers had meant to him in his childhood growing up, and what a difference they've made in his life. And that was a conversation that I'd never had with my dad before. So I had this felt sense that this was the right thing for me. And then getting that kind of feedback from my dad really galvanized my going and getting my MSW.
Yeah.
And my social work pride that I carry all these years.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great job. I've thought about getting an MSW so many times, but I think it's so interesting that your dad shared that with you, because when I think of my parents, which I imagine are around the same age as your parents, like that generation, it wasn't really a conversation the way it is today. And so that really strikes me as so special that he had a really positive experience with it.
Yeah, he didn't say much, did not say much, but talked about them being a very consistent presence, in a very consistent and positive presence over the course of his childhood. So.
That's nice. You and I have talked about the gap, and I feel like this whole conversation is going to be about the gap. And getting ready for today, I was like, okay, well, how do I summarize the gap in one sentence? And when I think of it, it's the space between, whether it's like me in a sexual assault, or, any variety of reasons where you had a traumatic experience. There's a space between acknowledging something happened, or acknowledging the effects of a thing that happened, and then seeking help for those things. But I feel like you're going to have a way better way to say that, because this is part of your daily vocabulary.
Sarah, as you say that, and I'm reflecting back on our conversation when we started to talk about the gap, it is this, this time between either, for some folks that have trauma experiences, it's very clear that something traumatic has happened. But sometimes for other folks, there's this sense of like, did that actually just happen? Like this sense of derealization that can happen, and coming to this process, this place of acknowledging that something in fact did happen. And then kind of reaching out to access support, whether that be seeking professional support services, or finding a support group, or connecting with other survivors, right? So that it's that space in between. And as you're talking about it, I remember having, I wish I could source it, but having someone explain trauma work in the following way. Is for someone to be able to say something happened, and it happened to me, and I'm okay. With the I'm okay piece being resiliency and kind of recovery and post-traumatic growth. So I think part of the gap is, this realization that something happened, and that it happened to me. And then the gap being the space between the next part of that process starting.
Yeah. And so in my experience, just even that first piece of saying something happened, and not just for me, for other survivors I know too, just saying something happened for me it took me a year to go to the police. It took me 3.5 years to tell my family, and they kind of found out by accident. And I've come to find out that's pretty normal. That's not even me saying, okay, I need help. That's literally just saying, oh, my life is a mess, something happened. When you can't, speak specifically about anyone, but when you look at your experience working with people, is that a pretty standard timeline of just acknowledging something happened, taking several years?
Absolutely. Or lifetimes for some people, right? And sometimes people are able to acknowledge it in certain pockets of their life, but not in other pockets. Like hearing you talk about how, the acknowledgement for you in your head and your experience, but then talking to your family about it and having that be a whole different piece. And so I think that it is very common. And it's not, as you said, it's not sometimes only the thing that happens, but the thing and then the impact it has. And realizing that, I think you said the words like realizing like my life's a mess, or I'm really not okay.
Yeah.
And being able to go through that process of stitching back that these pieces are connected to each other, the what happened and the how I'm doing. And I think part of what can be really challenging for survivors, and I think it's also challenging, for clinicians working with survivors, is that we get the perfect trauma image that happens. Like we talk a lot about the perfect victim, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Just the word, sorry, perfect trauma. I'm like, what is that?
yeah, so I'm making air quotes for
Yeah.
you can't see us, you can only hear us. Sort of this myth of the perfect victim, the perfect who is, they did absolutely nothing wrong, they were completely innocent, right? And so I think that there can also be this image of a perfect trauma where it's like it's very clear. It has a start and a finish, and the impact looks like PTSD and the DSM, and it's all a very, very clear equation. But unfortunately, most people's lived experiences aren't like that.
Yeah.
Right. That a lot of times the perpetrator most times the perpetrator is someone that is known in the survivor's life. There's some kind of prior relationship there. Like things are actually very, very, very not quite as clear as it gets portrayed as what sort of like a trauma event should look like, and who hurts other people and who gets hurt, and what that all looks like in the aftermath. And so this process of being able to realize that what happened was not okay and was wrong, and to start to put words to it and understand that impact is a whole process in and of itself that precedes being able to then take those next steps to not even have the words in your mind to how you think about it or what you call it, but then to be able to form those words and share them with other people. So there are all these pieces that happen that are in connection to each other and build on each other, that are all really, really important parts of the process of resiliency and recovery, and getting to that point, like that I'm okay point.
Yeah. Which when I'm thinking of the gap, I'm like, oh, sometimes even now I'm like, oh, that point feels so far away. And I think one thing that helped me kind of in the past to get me where I am now, and that helps me when I find myself in those lower moments and feel like I'm starting over, is finding language that I can relate to. And it's something, I think in general, at least where I grew up in Hawaii, like we didn't have an education around this in sex ed. Like we weren't taught anything about consent or how to communicate around intimacy. And so when I did have an experience, the words I had were like, that was weird. Like that was the only word I had, was that was really weird. And I remember my first therapist, she was trying to get me to like identify with sensations in my body. And she's like, well, how does that feel in your body? And I was like, I'm hungry. Like I had no language. I was literally like weird and hungry and crying. Those were like, I'm like, I don't know, I'm crying. I don't know, I'm hungry. I don't know, it feels weird, for like years. And I think it's so hard sometimes to find that language. And so for me, that sticks out as a really big tool in simply acknowledging that something happened. And I'm curious to hear, in your professional experience, are there other big things that stick out like that maybe people can latch onto?
Well, a word about the finding words and the language piece is there's a term that I will attribute it back to Stephen Porges, because that's who's coming to mind when I think of the term, is this felt sense. And so Porges talks about this felt sense of safety. Like when we really feel safe, we have this kind of felt sense in our bodies. And you're talking about this felt sense that something was off or not okay. And the word that came to mind when asked to put a word to it was like, it's weird. Like something is off here.
We're hungry.
We're hungry and crying. but this felt sense that what is like that there's something off here, that something's not right. There's been a transgression or a violation, and that we don't even we sense it in our bodies, but we don't know what the words are for it. And not only is it hard to find the words, but I think many cultures guide us to override that felt sense. And particularly for folks who are female identifying or female acculturated within certain cultures, is that we've been trained to override our felt sense of ickiness and weirdness in our bodies in service of not making other people feel uncomfortable. So I think that there's a lot that leads up to having that moment that you're talking about, where it's like, I just feels weird and I don't know how to put the words to it, because we've also been trained to override that and to ignore it and to continue to move on from it. So there's a lot of layers that have to be peeled back, I think, in that languaging piece.
That's a really good point, and gives me a weird, hungry feeling. No, it's upsetting to me when I hear that, because it is so true. We've really been taught, not to make other people uncomfortable. And I think even for survivors who have kind of made their way through the gap and are able to talk about their story, comfortably, in air quotes, there's still this sense of like, oh, do I have to warn you? Can I talk about this? And even me and some of my friends who are pretty open about our experience, I can now talk to my friends and family and just say, hey, I'm feeling a bit of post-traumatic symptoms right now. And I've been doing that for years. And sometimes it's still uncomfortable, because especially when you're in that affected state, you're like, well, gosh, I don't want this to be awkward. I don't feel like I can express what I'm feeling without making this other person feel that way. And there's so many fears of upsetting people. And the more upset we are, the worse that fear gets.
Yeah. And that piece about others' reactions is another critical piece about the gap, right? As we were thinking about talking about the gap today, I was trying to think about things about the gap. And one of them is how other people react. So you have your process of trying to find the words. And then, one of the pieces is starting to share that with people that care about you and help to hold you and support you through this. And it can be really challenging, because it's like, well, I don't want to make other people feel uncomfortable because it's so uncomfortable for me. And how do we help survivors learn to think about, where is my discomfort coming from, my hesitancy in sharing this with this other person? And is it because I love them and care about them and I don't want them to hurt? I don't want them to be hurt by what I have to say. I don't want them to be traumatized by the trauma I'm about to share. That's, one very real thing, versus, well, I don't want them to feel uncomfortable because the world did something uncomfortable to me, or another person did something uncomfortable to me. And helping folks to learn that maybe you kind of need to pick moments where you can drop the second piece and say, if other people feel uncomfortable with it, then they should, because this is really uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And it's the reality. But it's part of what keeps survivors silenced, right? I think we talked one time about this quote from Judy Herman, who wrote Trauma and Recovery, that silence is the first line of defense of the perpetrator. And I think,
can you say that one more time?
Sure. Silence is the first line of defense of the perpetrator.
Oh, that's so good.
And so I think, the inability to articulate experiences is part of what helps the perpetrator to get away with whatever they're getting away with. But I think we can also scale that to a societal level, is that folks don't want to look deeply at experiences of sexual violence and rape, because it makes it, what does that mean about what we endorse and what we look towards and what we look away from, right? And so I think all of that ties back into, again, helping survivors sometimes need to drop that piece where other people might feel uncomfortable by what you have to say, and they should, because it is uncomfortable. And it's something we all need to examine as folks who live in cultures that allow silence to exist around sexual violence.
One thing that really stuck out, talking about having that first conversation, I thought, is I think for a lot of people, because the perpetrator is someone they know, that's usually the first, well, I won't say usually because I don't know, but in my experience, that was the first person I talked to about it. I was like, that was weird. What happened? And I actually said, I was like, I think you raped me. And of course, he's like, no, I didn't. This and this happened. And it's just like, gosh, how I'm just expressing frustration right now. And it's like, it's often people you trust or have some sort of relationship with. It's very likely as a survivor, you're going to check in with that person because you don't understand the experience and you will immediately be told you're crazy or that you completely fabricated this whole thing. Or like in my case, he was like, if you go to the police, I'll sue you because you're slandering my name. And it's it just makes it so much harder then to reach out to that next person or even the police or even to go to a hospital, right?
Right. And it's this, I mean, I think it ties back to that being trained to override it. That's like something, there's been a transgression or a violation here, and I think we learn to override it when we're sitting on public transportation and someone, does the huge knee spread and they're in our space, and we sit there uncomfortable and we kind of shift our weight over to the side because it's like, I'll be uncomfortable over here rather than making you uncomfortable by telling you that you're in my space, right? And so I think there's that tendency, and that has to be overridden. And then we enter into the next piece of the gaslighting, and that actually didn't happen, and the questioning, and all of that I think ties back again to like chipping away at trying to find that perfect scenario that is unimpeachable. And if it doesn't look like that, then it couldn't have been because of all these other things. And I think it's so endemic in every system. Like I remember this is years ago, I was a very, very young clinician. I remember being in a group for rape survivors. I was a trainer, and I won't identify the institution that this was associated with, but it was training kind of other people to learn to support survivors. And we had a survivor came in and told their story. And one of the members of the training was there voluntarily because they wanted to support survivors actually said to the survivor, "I don't think I ever heard you say no." And it's like, wow, like here we are in this very space, yet this indoctrination is so strong that that we would kind of try to chip away at the validity of the person's experience, right, up against a checklist of what we think it's supposed to look like or we've been told it looks like, right?
That breaks my heart.
Heartbreaking.
Oh my God.
Heartbreaking.
I can't imagine. Oh, so what are things, so in that situation, like as a survivor or as someone witnessing that, well, these are two separate questions really. So one, as a survivor, what can you do to make moves to override that training? Or when people hear your story and they're like, well, are you sure? Because there's so many voices telling you, no, that wasn't the perfect trauma. You just feel weird because something's wrong with you. Like, how can we work on that individually?
Well, I think sometimes it's about thinking about, who are the people that you're going to disclose to.
Yeah.
And why are you disclosing? And disclosure is, encouraged and supported because we need relationships. We need people to hold us in the aftermath of awful experiences. And so thinking about who is it that you need to be there as the fabric of what's holding you, and being able to tell them, I'm going to tell you something now, and here is what I need from you. Here's what I need from you in response. I don't want you to ask me questions. I don't want to go through the details. I just need you to know about this and to listen to me and to be with me after I tell you. Right. So, and so I think once we start with those people that we need as the fabric to support us, as we hopefully people have that fabric and they start to build it, not building it through professional supports and support groups with other survivors. But it's okay to start to kind of pre-mortem as opposed to post-mortem. I'm stealing that from a friend. To pre-mortem what you need out of that conversation, because people sometimes don't know how to respond, and that indoctrination kicks up in that moment because they don't have anything else to say. And so maybe telling someone what it is that I need from you in this moment can be a way to give them a template for how to respond that's going to meet what you need.
I think that's a really, really great point. And just it's I love premortem. I think when I was thinking about telling my parents, I talked to a friend about it, and he was like, well, what if you just tell them like something's going on and you might need a safety net, and you don't need to tell them what it is. You don't need to, but just that if you really need it, it's there, and they know something's going on. But I think people oftentimes, when they do hear a survivor's story, want to help almost to a fault, but they don't have the resources or the know-how, and can end up doing more harm. And so just saying, I need this from you. I just need to say it. You please don't try to help me right now. I've heard just horrible stories. Actually, the last interview I did, she told the story of the first time she told someone she was a survivor, it's because she needed medical attention, and that person then went and called her whole family and brought her whole family to the house, and she literally like escaped, and was, because the best intentions that can go so terribly wrong.
Yeah, and it unfortunately it puts the work back on the survivor a little bit, because people generally, if people love you and care about you, are a part of your life, people do want to be helpful, but they don't know how.
Yeah.
And or the other times people get the like, well, let me know if you need anything. And it's like, well, I need like 8,000 things, and I don't even know how to start to put words to them. So I think that it's about opening the conversation and allowing the conversation to continue to happen is another way to think about the disclosure, rather than it being like, well, I've now shared it with you. Let's never overtly discuss it again, but we're both going to have it hanging in the air between us. Like, how do you start to open the beginning of a conversation in which you share your experience with someone and invite them to be part of your journey towards recovery and resilience, and getting 100%, 110% of your life back, right?
Yeah, I really like that you point out having it being an ongoing conversation, because I think a lot of times by the time you're at the point where you are ready to tell someone, it's probably built up so much inside of you, right? And so it feels like you have to say everything, which makes it so much more overwhelming for you and the listener. But allowing just that one little step of like, I had a difficult experience. I don't know how to deal with it. You don't need to say anything. Maybe we can talk about it later. Like literally just one little granular piece at a time. It's easier on both parties, I think.
Yeah. And if people, and then there's the other piece of like, and we can talk about it later, and it'll be up to me when we're going to talk about it, right?
Yeah.
I choose the time. But if folks have questions, to say, like, I'm sure you must have questions about this, and I'd love at some point in the future for us to sit down and take 10 minutes and talk about those questions, but that's not something I'm able to do right now, and I'll let you know when I can.
Yeah, and it's, it sounds, I think people who haven't worked with trauma survivors or been through trauma survivors would hear this and just say like, well, that's really basic, like that's a 5-minute conversation. But I think just getting to the point where you're even okay with saying, I can only talk about this 5 minutes at a time, there's so much work that goes into that. And so I just want to say, for people listening, like if you can only talk about it a minute at a time, like you're doing great just by being able to get to that point.
Yeah, and that those minutes, whether it's 5 minutes or 1 minute, are really hard, and they take a lot. And sometimes people are able to have that 5-minute conversation, and then they go home and they go to bed for the rest of the day, or they feel like their feet aren't under them for 2 or 3 days after that 5 minutes, and that's all part of the process, and of being able to kind of this process that something happened and it happened to me, right?
Yeah.
And that the people, like as you said, unless it's happened to you or you're working with folks that it's happened to, people don't understand that what comes after those five, let up to those 5 minutes or what comes after.
Yeah. This
Yeah.
reminds me a lot of what was it, a Life Kit episode I heard on NPR about how to come out, and it was during Pride Month, and it was really similar. It's just like, you decide what you want to say and for how long, and you get to tell people how to respond in a way. Like, obviously we can't control them, but you can really kind of make that safe space for yourself, and just remember that you have control over what you say, and you can let others know how to be respectful and supportive of you.
And I think it's challenging for the supporters as well, because they love you and you're their family member and their friend or the member of their community, and um, that those supporters oftentimes don't get any support in what the news that they have received, right? So they're kind of this idea that they're trying to support the survivor, but they're also not getting any support themselves, or maybe don't feel that they are entitled to support, right? For
Yeah.
their own support. And so one of the things that I've learned over the years and years that I've been doing this work is really coming to the understanding that everybody is actually doing the best. Most people, 99.9% of people are actually doing the best that they can.
Yeah, those other people are just the worst.
That 1% we're not going to talk about, that 0.1%.
That awful 0.1%. Yeah, it's true. We're all just doing our best. And especially on the topic of just intimacy violence and sexual assault and any of this, most of us have no idea how to talk about it. And so, I think of, my mind goes to hotlines here for in case you're afraid to tell your loved ones, like I was. That was like the last person I wanted to know was my mom and dad. But also, I'm curious, as a side note, if you're someone whose friend or family member just told you they were assaulted and you need support, is it appropriate to call like the RAINN hotline for that if you're trying to process someone else's trauma?
So I think it is appropriate for family members to contact rape crisis hotlines, and to have an ear to talk to. They also can say, hey, there is actually a support group for parents that is happening in a town near you. So I think there's a lot of great organizations have recognized the need to bring that next ring of support around to the supporters of the survivor. And so it's very common for there to be significant other support groups, sibling support groups, parent support groups where people can get support. And those hotlines are perfect ways to find out about them.
Yeah. In your mind, does calling a hotline as a survivor kind of fall into the same category as seeking out therapy?
Well, that's a good question. I think it falls into the same thread. Yeah, it's about starting to put words to experiences that you don't have words to, and it's talking, and it's not just your internal process of learning to speak of it, but it's also allowing someone to be present and bear witness. And I think therapy is, in my opinion, kind of trauma therapy is really the deep bearing witness of the suffering of another person. And I think hotlines also provide it to scale the same thing, but at a smaller scale.
Yeah, which might be, I've always found this so interesting about hotlines, because in a lot of ways, I think they're so much more accessible because you can just call somebody with no attachment and say like, hey, I'm freaking out. I don't know, this thing happened. Cool, thanks, bye. Like, thanks for the breathing exercise. But at the same time, like from my own experience, I was like, I don't want to call that hotline. It says rape crisis hotline. Like, that's not what happened to me. And so there's a little bit of a mismatch there for me. And I think that's from the survivors I've talked to, I find I'm not alone in that, and wanting that bite-sized piece, but being afraid of the umbrella it's under.
Well, it's also because it's not just rape crisis hotline. It's like, well, rape, well, I don't know that that's what happened to me, the word I'm using, but also a crisis. Like, am I in crisis? Is it appropriate for me? But I think, on behalf of all hotlines out there, I will say, you don't have to be, it doesn't have to fit perfectly, that there is another human being there for you to just even start to try to start to put words to it, and let that be part of your process. Again, the little kind of, those little steps, I think, all lead to you moving down a pathway, even though it might not feel like the perfect step for you.
Yeah. I should add in for listeners, I have since used hotlines, and I think they're great. Like,
Yes.
I think they're really, really wonderful things. And I'm so grateful they're available 24/7 around the whole country. It's wonderful. As we kind of work our way through the gap, it seems like the end goal is to get professional support. And I, like, in my mind, that's like the right thing to do. And I think the narrative is, yeah, you should go to therapy. But do we have to go to therapy as survivors? Like, is that the right answer for everybody?
And if so, if it is the right answer, which type of therapy do I go to, and what type of, right?
Yeah.
So, it's interesting. I don't want to get, all geeky with statistics.
We can always edit it out if it's too much. I'd say go for it.
I think that not everybody develops PTSD. Not everybody. I mean, I think in studies of combat veterans, it's like 10 to 30% of folks in combat are going to present with a full-blown PTSD, or fully diagnostic PTSD later on. And I think the statistics are similar for rape survivors, that not everybody develops things that are interfering with their life. It's a very complicated equation. When people always ask, well, who gets PTSD, who doesn't? And it's all, earlier life experiences, how much support you have, risk and protective factors, what else is going on, genetics, like there's all this kind of complicated equation. And you can't just kind of be like, well, this person is yes, and this person's no. It's really about what each individual needs. And sometimes people are able to, in the gap, start to make those connections and to be held in the fabric of community and support, and to be able to integrate this experience into their lifeline, or their narrative about their life, and to make meaning of it and go on without professional help. And so I think it's really about what each person feels that they need and what they're drawn to. That being said, there are some folks that don't seek out support, professional support, and they kind of bury it deep down inside. They develop workarounds so that they can live their lives that aren't super healthy. Healthy meaning life-giving for them. Yeah. And eventually, over time, they might decide that they want to change something about their life, and then they get into therapy years later. And it's really about the sexual assault that happened 15 years ago. But even though it looks like it's relationship problems 15 years later, now that's the problem.
Yeah.
So I don't think it's that you have to go to therapy, you have to go straight into therapy. But you don't have to live alone with this. And so what that support is going to look like for each individual person is going to be unique.
I love the way you said that. It's just like, because it kind of takes away the should, right? It's not that you should do this or that, it's that you don't need to do it on your own. And so however that manifests for you. You said one other thing I want to ask about, which is to make meaning of an experience. And that's something I think about a lot, actually, because I talk to, the longer I'm doing the app for survivors and the nonprofit for survivors, the more people come up to me and they're like, oh, well, this happened to me too, and I never told anybody, and I always felt like I was supposed to do something with my trauma. And I get that there's this thing of like, oh, I had a hard experience, and so I have to turn it in to strength, or I have to turn it into a nonprofit, and I don't agree with that. Oftentimes I'll just tell them like, no, all you have to do is heal. Like, all you have to do is find peace in yourself, whatever that means. Can you speak a little bit more about making meaning of an experience?
Yeah. So I think again, the ideal that you just outlined is something very common as well. Like I think it kind of, this idea that you would be able to eventually like go tell your story is a sign that you have fully healed and you're okay, right? And really, I think, you said it beautifully, Sarah. Is just, the goal is for you to just go live your life. And for some, for some survivors, it's just like to be able to go live an ordinary life that's kind of boring and doesn't have
Yeah.
any drama and no nightmares, and just to
Yeah.
have it be like everybody else's life.
Like
And
you don't need trauma naps every other day.
no trauma naps. So that is as valid as starting a nonprofit, right? The pathway to be able to have some sense of meaning making, and I think maybe meaning making isn't the word that we want to use. Maybe it's thinking about, post traumatic growth, and what that looks like. I tend to use the term meaning making kind of more out of the kind of spirituality work that I do, of like how people make sense of the world, and how do you make sense of experience of violence, that like how does that fit within your worldview, how do you reconcile that? And I think with a lot of folks, I'm thinking about religion, and how do you make sense of, for the image of God that some folks will have in their mind, and where is that a supportive and protective image relative to their trauma? Or how did this happen? How does a God that I believe in, that is loving and kind, have a world where this type of pain exists, right?
Yeah. And
yeah, so that's
like get there too, to not then be like, well, I must be punished, I did something wrong and that's why this happened to me.
yeah,
Yeah,
exactly, to not turn it back, that again, that there's a fault of ourselves, or that like if I not quite sure what I'm trying to say, more that I deserve this somehow because of I was raised Catholic, so of course it's all very punitive. Like, well, this is payback for something else that you've done, like, right?
yeah.
And so and I see people make meaning of it in so many amazing ways. I work with my practices with immigrants and refugees, and with survivors of torture specifically, and trafficking. And it's a survivor deciding to be an interpreter for someone from their country in their meetings with their lawyer, and that's meaning making for them. For some, and I always tell my clients, like, your existence is an act of resistance.
Yeah,
That the fact, right, that you're still here every day is resistance. And so how does your daily life become an act of resistance? That is deep meaning making, of being able to go out and say, today I'm going to love and live and play, and I will have, at the end of the day, I will have won. I will be powerful. And that is meaning making and activism. And so what form, what vessel that's going to take is different for each survivor.
You're reminding me, I got like a warm fuzzy feeling as you were saying that, and it reminds me of a friend of mine who's very, very has a lot of things to say. I'll just leave it at that, especially about politics. But he once told me that self-care is the highest form of resistance. It's just like, you want to, just doing you, basically you just doing you is such a powerful act that I think we often overlook. And that kind of comes back to that voice we're talking about of I shouldn't do this or that. I shouldn't make other people uncomfortable. I shouldn't need a day just to like shower and cook a healthy meal, because that's where I'm at right now.
Yeah, and I think Audre Lorde was the person who framed the self-care as an act of resistance, if I remember correctly. And I think it's not just self-care, it's self-preservation.
Yeah.
Right? Is preserving yourself, your existence, and your being, and your life force, right?
Yeah.
And that having so very much power, even in those moments where what I accomplished today was showering.
Yeah.
Yay.
I wish people talked about that more, if just like instead of posting on Facebook, like, hey, everybody, I just had a great week in Cancun, just like, hey, everybody, I've been really depressed for a week, but today I showered. Like, that's a real thing.
And posted it on Facebook.
Yeah. And I
Progress.
wrote it on Facebook. Hashtag blessed. Yeah. So I guess the gap it's so in my mind because of my experience, right? Like, of course, I see it all through my own lens. It's like this happened. There's this time that passes. That's the gap, and it kind of ended with me finding the right therapist and sticking with that therapist and doing the work. But what I really like about this conversation is that that's not the right answer. That's the answer for me. But a lot of the work in the gap is just finding what gives you that sense of peace and like finding how you make meaning, whatever making meaning means to you.
Yeah. And I think it's, maybe we need to redefine the gap a little bit as we're talking is,
Sure.
is it the time between the realization and kind of getting professional help? No, maybe it's the realization and then that time when you are able to seek support and to draw people and to be able to be held in whatever way it is to be held. Because I think the one thing we don't want is people living their life in the gap.
Yeah.
Right. And for sometimes, that some people show up at therapist's office 40 years later and are like, this something happened a long time ago and I've never talked to anybody about it before. And it's like, well, that's kind of living life in the gap for some folks, right? That you've had this painful piece of you that you've had to hold away from the people that you're closest to.
Yeah.
And so I think it's about, how do you help? I like the image of having other sets of hands to hold something heavy.
Yeah.
And so like, where is it that you let other hands start to hold for you as well?
Yeah. It makes me think of hiking. I do a lot of day trips and like overnight backpacking trips. And sometimes, like if one of us is just really tired that day, or if we had a fall, we'll just like take out 3 liters of water that our friend can carry and know that like we're all going to the same place and it's okay to have the weight be carried.
Yep, exactly.
I think a lot of the people listening to this are generally in the space of in the gap and aware they're in the gap. But what about the people who live their whole life in the gap? Like, what are some definite things we can say? Like, yep, if I know it's never that cut and dry, but like, if X, then you're in the gap. Like, one thing I think of is if you have unexplained anxiety, like I never had anxiety until I was in the gap, and then everything was just super high level anxiety. What are things? I'm talking to like your clinical brain now.
A lot of avoidance, right? So is it that I can no longer go to parties with too many people, or I can't go to this particular geographic area, part of the city. That avoidance, when you start to notice that you have, and you start to develop a workaround, what we call workarounds, right? Because everybody has these, what we kind of clinically call adaptations, but more easily talked about as workarounds, where like, oh, I can't trying to think, I can't go to the grocery store when it's too crowded. And so I now can only go to the grocery store at 8:00 at night, because then there's only a couple of other people in the store. And my car has to be parked in a certain spot where it's under a street light, so that, some of it's about thinking about your safety, right? And we want people to think about your safety, because thinking about your safety is helping to keep you alive. We don't want to take that away or make it seem like it's a bad thing. But when there's this avoidance where you're starting to develop these workarounds in your life that are starting to become elaborate, that's a sign that you might be living in the gap. Not being able to do the things that you used to love to do, right, anymore, like that might be a sign that you're living in the gap. And then a lot of times people struggle with and kind of intrusive things, like intrusive memories, flashbacks, nightmares, thoughts that come in, or sensations that kind of come in, that can really be incredibly distressing and throw you off for the rest of your day. If that kind of thing is happening to you frequently, that's another sign that you're living in the gap, and might want to seek a little bit of support. And then to kind of continue with that, the workaround that a lot of people have developed with the intrusive stuff is substance use, right? So starting to use substances to take away as a way of avoiding thinking about it and remembering. And then, so that can be another kind of thinking about the function of substance use. Like, what is it doing? Is it helping you to avoid things that you don't want to feel? Is it helping you to not think about things? That can be another thing that we would like to, it might be worth touching base with some professional support.
I'm really glad you touched on that one, because it didn't come to mind, but it is one so common. And especially if I look at, for like at the nonprofit at SARA, I'm really looking at college students, where experimenting with substances is kind of part of that experience, right? Regardless of what we want our parents to think, like that's part of what happens in college. And I think it can be really easy, especially in like your early 20s, for example, to be like, nothing happened. I'm not drinking more. I'm just like, this is the time of my life where I do that. So if people notice it, to really take a moment of pause and to look at that.
And to think about the why.
Yeah.
Right. And people use substances because they're super effective.
Yeah.
They're very good at what they do. Right.
Yeah.
So just noticing your trends, noticing your patterns, noticing, as you think about kind of, is it something you're using to avoid unwanted feelings or situations? Is it that what happens when you don't use substances? Is that kind of peeling back and seeing that there's a lot of trauma stuff happening there when the substance is taken away? So it's very common to kind of see the interaction between those two things.
Yeah. Would you add in with substance use and abuse, the things I think of when you say that are also overworking, and like, I don't know if this is a thing in like the DSM, but I swear TV addiction is a thing. Like in social media, there are things that are made to grab our attention and made to feel urgent. And I know when I'm in my little mini gaps where I like, realize I'm just having a harder time, that's one of the first things to happen is I'll be overworking or I'll be watching too much TV. And then I'll be like, oh, not quite the same as a substance, but for the purpose of this conversation, do you think it's similar?
I think it, the way you're talking about it is you notice that that's the sign that you're in a mini gap, right? And so,
Yeah.
Which is amazing that you have such wonderful insight into when your practices are slipping like that and what they look like. But they're methods of avoidance, right?
Yeah.
And I think that it's also about, trauma takes us out post trauma, life after trauma, right? One of the cruel things that trauma does is it takes us out of our ability to be connected to the present moment. Yeah. Right. And so TV is a great disconnect from the present moment, right? You get to lose yourself someplace else. And I think overworking is another common thing, particularly when you have something that you're passionate about. Of course, like I'm super guilty of this as well, because I'm passionate about the work that I do, is that you could always be doing more, always be pushing more. And, sometimes it can be a level of avoidance of what happens when you close the laptop and sitting with what you're actually feeling inside. And sometimes it can be healthy as part of your meaning making, as you're talking about, but making sure that it has balance to it.
Yeah, that's the key part.
Yep. Oh, yes, I know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the more we talk about this, the more, so for example, like leading into this and at the beginning, I've really seen the gap as like, for me, a 3-year period, but like this big chunk of time that could be, maybe a month for some people, maybe a lifetime for others, but then you like get through it and you're quote unquote healed, and it's just kind of maintenance from there. But the more we talk about it, the more I realize, again, mostly for my own thing, it's like, well, there's a big gap and then you get over the big hump and then there's a lot of little humps, and it's it's just this ongoing practice, right, of just kind of riding waves. Like, is there anyone who gets past the gap and then they're legit just like fine after that?
They're done. Never another bad day, never another trigger.
Just like, no, I'm fine. I processed my trauma. I'm good.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are, again, it's that kind of interesting, complicated formula, right? Of someone else's total life experiences have been like. And, is there someone out there who processed their trauma and never got triggered again? I'm sure that there is someone out there. I have yet to have met them.
I can't imagine that being a real human.
Yeah. I mean, it's something someone might have done all the work. They've done all the therapies. They've processed it. They can talk about it. They're good to go. And, you're sitting in a movie theater 7 years later, and all of a sudden there's something super violent that happens on the screen. And there's that constriction, right? And that tightening of that, like that unexpected thing all of a sudden is there.
Yeah.
I think that's it's not about that never happening again. It's being able to say, oh, there's that feeling of that's really familiar. And I know how to breathe through it right now, and to call somebody tonight and say, hey, something came up, and to talk it through and to seek support around it.
It's not a linear process, right? Almost never.
It is not.
I think this touched on a lot of points that will be really relatable for people. And so to feel understood, but also then to have a little more perspective of what this is in the bigger picture, and then your insights of like what we can actually do about it. Like how trauma changes our brains and then how we can change it back. Because I just think, one, it's super cool, and I would love to hear you nerd out about it. And I think it's something that no matter how depressed someone feels or how hopeless they feel, just knowing that there's science about this is really comforting.
So this could be and actually is an entire like semester long class at like a medical school. So we'll try to cover it in like 5 minutes. So I think one of the things is when there's a life threat that happens, our bodies are designed to respond in a certain way, right? And so there's that thing that we hear about of like fight, flight, freeze, those trauma responses. And our brain is designed to respond kind of outside of consciousness, right? So something happens, you're walking down the street, there's like a super loud sound behind you, you're going to jump, right? And then you're like, whoa, what was that? You're not like, what is that? Should I jump? You just jump, right? And so after a trauma occurs, the body is going to continue to look for similar threats. Like it has detected something has happened. There was a threat to your safety that the body had to respond to. And so it's going to continue to look for threat over and over and over again. And that is literally what your brain was designed to do. And so I think a lot of times when I meet survivors kind of in the up close aftermath of a trauma experience happening, and they say, I'm so jumpy, I can't do this, I'm so like, I can't concentrate on anything. It's like, wow, yeah, that's your body doing exactly what it was designed to do and what it needs to be doing right now. And that can be a huge sense of relief. Our brains continue to scan our environment for any potential threat that it needs to be ready to respond to. Because we are human beings and we kind of have thinking, we tend to assign meaning to things, right? And so like my classic example is that I use with my students all the time is that if something happened with a person in a red shirt, we will then globalize, right? And then all of a sudden all red shirts become dangerous. So every time we see a red shirt, our body's saying danger, 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 and we go into that survival response. But our brains are incredible in that they can continue to grow neuronal pathways and they can be rewired. And so, part of what we do in therapy is helping to learn that actually not that red shirt really was dangerous, but not all red shirts are dangerous going forward, to help break those associations and to be able to rewire our brains into being connected in the present moment so that we can have awareness of what's happening in our bodies, what our reactions are, and to bring in choices about how we are going to be able to respond in the moment when there is not actually a threat. I want to be very clear about that.
Yeah.
Because I do work with so many people for whom there is ongoing threat. It's community violence, it's gun violence, it's unsafe schools. And we don't ever want to override their responses. We want them to help to help those folks to be able to be more accurate in what they're responding to be able to kind of recover and feel safe and confident so that they can keep themselves safe. So, you talked about breathing exercises on a hotline. So learning how to breathe is learning how to connect into your body and to be connected to the present moment. And those are the ways that we actually can help to rewire our brains so that we are reflecting on our experience in the present moment and connected to where we are when the threat has passed.
Yeah.
Right? When we actually are safe.
Yeah. So for people who, let's say there's somebody listening who doesn't feel like they can call a hotline or tell a friend or a family member, and they can't use the app I'm building because it's not ready yet.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any resources you recommend for kind of finding a way back to that present moment?
Sure. So it's, different things work for different people. So some people are able to meditate and kind of use a meditation app, and that can be really helpful. Anything that's guided breathing is going to be helpful. So just even learning to take a breath in for 4 beats, hold it for 4 beats, and relax it for 4 beats is going to be really helpful. Yeah. Go for a walk, look around you. When we start to kind of think about, self-care practices, what you would consider self-care, those are actually things that are helping your brain to be connected to the present moment and reflect on how you're doing. Some folks will use art or music that as a way of being in the present moment, being embodied. Like all of those are things that people, if those are things you have in your life that you can turn to, that are actually incredible trauma interventions, even though you might not think about them that way. Yeah. You mentioned cooking.
Love it.
Love it. Cooking.
Yeah.
Listening to some music, anything that's going to make you feel in the moment. And, some simple things like look around the room and notice and say to yourself, like, I noticed that there are 3 lamps in this room. I noticed that there are 2 windows. Like those are all things that we can do that will help to kind of bring us into the present moment and ultimately settle our nervous system a little bit.
I feel like if I had to sum all of that up in 2 words, it'd kind of be like you're looking for wholesome stillness, like something that grabs you, not from drugs or bungee jumping, it's like something that holds you for a bit, that is just allows you to make space.
And to learn to do it with intentionality. Like I'm going to do this for myself right now, not by accident. It's not a default because you don't know what else to do. I'm doing this for myself, and to do it frequently. Right. Yeah. So it's the difference between like having a cup of tea off to the side while you're working and making yourself a cup of tea and sitting and holding it and smelling it and saying, I'm just going to sit here and drink this tea.
Yeah. Oh, I want tea now. Tea's one of my go-tos, actually, that exact thing of just like feeling the cup cool and smelling the tea and looking at the little tag. I get, and yeah, this is they're not a sponsor or anything. We don't have sponsors yet, but like Yogi tea, they always have little sweet things on the tag, like those little joyful details. Is there anything you want to add in?
Yeah, I think you said a word a few minutes ago, and I wrote it down. I circled it 15 times, is the word hope.
Oh, yeah, let's talk about hope.
Let's talk about hope. That, there, as we think about, for those of you who are listening, who are being like, whoa, I'm in the gap.
Yeah.
I've been here for a while. Is that there's always is to hold on to hope that your life doesn't have to look like this forever, right? That you're in a moment in time and that it can change. And again, that pathway to how it can change is going to be different for different folks. So for some, it might be therapy, professional therapy, we talked about being held in the fabric of community or having the extra set of hands, but it does not have to be this way. It can change. And so just to kind of bring a message of hope into the gap, that hope lives in the gap, I think is what I want to say.
Hope lives in the gap. Hello, everyone. Thank you for listening. This is Sarah one more time, letting you know that this show is brought to you by you, the listeners. So if you like this episode, be sure to subscribe, leave us a rating, or leave us a direct donation at safewithsarah.org. Speaking of safewithsara.org, if you are a survivor or ally and you want to be notified when our mobile app is ready, make sure you get on our mailing list at safewithsara.org. If you want to be on the show or recommend someone you'd like to hear from on the show, email me at sarah@safewithsara.org. Thanks.